So, this is the better known guest I've ever had on this podcast, Nick Srnicek, author of Platform Capitalism, author of Silicon Empires, and he's one of the thinkers who shaped how we understand platforms, AI, and power today. So, if you work in research, if you build startups, or if you care about innovation policy, his ideas already shape your world, whether you know it or not. So this episode starts from his core insight. Innovation is not just about pushing the frontier, but about who controls diffusion. In our conversation, Nick makes a point that matters enormously right now. There's a lot to be gained by diffusion, not just by pushing the frontier. That single sentence explains a lot of what is happening in AI, platforms, and innovation policy. Nick has spent years studying how platforms became economic actors, how AI power concentrates, and how states and corporations are now locked in a struggle over control. So this episode builds around that conversation, not as commentary, but as an application. I use Nick's insight to unpack an important pattern, why massive spending, especially in defense, does not automatically produce resilient innovation. Military Keynesianism sits in the background of this episode, has the context, not the star. The real focus is what Nick's work helps us see. That innovation without diffusion creates lock-in. And lock-in is the hidden risk for researchers and startups. So in this episode, I give you the full scaffold up front. First, I connect Nick's thinking on platforms and AI to today's funding logic. Second, I show two short decision cases as examples, one that followed the money and stalled, one that used funding to build long-term relevance. Third, I give you one simple task, a one-page test inspired directly by this interview. All of these links back to the same framework, the one I developed in my book, Transition Science in the Economy. It was published last year, November, and it asks a simple question. Not how much we invest, but where those investments take us. This episode is the applied version of that question. So, grounded in a rare conversation with one of the most influential thinkers of our time, stay with me. If you understand Nick's Srnicek's work, you will understand why so many innovation strategies look strong today and age badly tomorrow. This episode of InnvoEU, the EU Project Chronicles, is brought to you by my new book, Transition Science in the Economy. In it, I use data from more than 180 countries and 150,000 observations, data points, to show how five global shifts, five global transitions, the digital, the green, the new globalization, the transition to a war economy, and the housing crisis transition, how these five transitions are collapsing the middle class and rewriting prosperity and power. So if you want a clear map of today's economy and economic chaos, search for Transition Science in the Economy on Amazon and get your copy. This section about military Keynesianism, AWTY, and transition science connects what you already see in geopolitics to how you should think about research, innovation, and strategy. Military Keynesianism is not new. It has become the dominant operating system, in fact. Russia relies on defense industry to keep its economy functioning. The United States has long used defense spending as a macroeconomic stabilizer. And Europe, under direct attack and new threats, is mobilizing its strongest assets, its economy and innovation capacity, all in the service of defense. This is exactly why transition science exists. And here is the key AWTY insight. Countries can score higher on the war economy dimension while silently degrading their digital, their green, the housing, or the new globalization transitions. That looks like strength in the short term, and that it creates fragility in the medium term. Military Keynesianism is very effective at mobilization. It is weak at diffusion. AWTY makes this visible. The data makes this visible. Defense-heavy trajectories tend to concentrate innovation inside closed systems. Well, knowledge circulates less, spillovers are weakened, and civilian adoption slows. This is where researchers and startups can get trapped. If you optimize only for the war economy signal, if you do that, you may align perfectly with funding today and drift away from long-term transition readiness. So your project becomes legible to defense evaluators, but opaque to markets, cities, or civilian users. Transition science reframes that problem. Innovation is won not by maximizing one transition, it is about keeping multiple transitions advancing at the same time. Defense funding should be treated as a transition accelerator, not as a destination. Civilian diffusion must be explicit from day one in any project. Optionality across transitions must also be preserved. This is why AWTY matters for strategy. It lets you see whether a country, a sector, or a project is building balanced resilience or simply inflating one dimension at the expense of the others. And this is the core message of transition science in the economy. Static indicators like GDP or research and development spending, they tell you how much, they don't tell you where you are heading. Transition science focuses on trajectories. AWTY makes those trajectories measurable. If your research, your startup only fits the war economy narrative, it's fragile. If it can translate defense-driven investment into civilian diffusion across energy, digital systems, or markets, or housing, it is anti-fragile. So military Keynesianism will shape budgets. There's no way around that in the near future. Transition science decides who still matters when the transition phase changes, when the budgets change again. So I'm going to show you two decisions that showcase how to separate winners from dead ends. Now, let me make this concrete with those two short cases. They're not success stories, decision stories. So first case, defense alignment without a second life. So this European research consortium built a technically impressive system aligned perfectly with defense priorities. So funding promises a lot and evaluations were kind. But they did design diffusion. The technology depends on military-grade specifications, and IP will be locked inside procurement contracts. They didn't define who will be civilian users or who can they be. When defense priorities shift again, that project may be in a dead end. No spin-offs, no civilian adoption, no second life. From a AWTY perspective, this strengthened the war economy dimension. This project contributed to the war economy dimension. But it's weak in the long-term digital and new globalization readiness, for example. So the lesson is simple. Sorry. Funding success doesn't mean transition success. Short term, long run. Second case, dual use design for diffusion. This is another true story, a small startup working on resilient communications. So they are entering the defense programs deliberately. They treat defense funding as phase zero, not the end goal. They want to use defense funding to start the project and put it in cruise mode. From day one, the architecture is going to be modular. Civilian use cases are explicitly included. Cities, energy operators, infrastructure providers, other possible customers. So defense funding is used to accelerate the development. But the true end, the civilian markets are the true end. Those are the markets that will enable scaling. This is used in transition science in practice. One funding source, multiple transition pathways. So AWTY logic would classify this as a balanced trajectory building, not dependency. Well, in fact, these two cases explain the real divide in the present day. Military Keynesianism creates momentum, and it can be used, that momentum. But you gotta choose your direction, long-term direction. Transition science helps determine the direction. So, just to end, I'm gonna give you one simple task, just one. It's the fastest way I know to avoid dead-end projects. Take your project, your current project, your proposal, your startup idea, open a blank page, and at the top, write the core funding logic you are presently working on. Defense, security, dual use, strategic autonomy, whatever. Now answer three questions in that page, only one page. First, who is the civilian user if defense priorities disappear tomorrow? It won't. They won't. But imagine they will. Someday they will. Not a vague category, a concrete user. Build a persona for that civilian user. Second question, what part of your technology survives outside military specifications? You gotta be precise. Architecture, data, processes, capabilities, whatever. Third question, which other transition does your project actively strengthen? Digital, green, housing, new globalization? Which one, if any? If you cannot answer all three questions clearly, there are fragilities in your project you should consider. Doesn't mean it's bad. It means it is exposed to funding cycles. Projects that pass this test tend to survive call changes, evaluator shifts, political reorientation. So this is transition science applied. No more information, just better positioning. So today I have the pleasure of welcome to InnvoEU, the EU Project Chronicles, Nick Srnicek. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. His work on platform capitalism helps us understand digital platforms, has core economic actors actually that have reshaped or are reshaping markets and power structures. So thank you very much for being here. You
Thank you very much for having me.
Are you based in where? London?
I'm based in London, yeah, although I'm originally from Canada.
Okay, so Professor Nick Srnicek is a senior lecturer in digital economy at King's College London, right?
Yes.
He's the author of Platform Capitalism, and this is an expression I use daily, both when I write and when I teach. And I always use it with this base, and based on this book. It's a key text. It became a key text on how digital platforms are shaping today's economy, today's capitalism, by leveraging data network effects. But that's not all. He is also the co-author of hashtag Accelerate and the author of Silicon Empires, a book on the global geopolitical struggle over AI power. This is exciting. And I believe this is your most recent work. So is it okay? Would you
Yeah.
start there? Would you tell us a little bit about what's the idea in this latest book?
Yeah. So I'll maybe step back a little bit because when I was writing Platform Capitalism, one of the key things I was trying to do in writing it was simply to understand for myself what was going on with platforms. Because I remember distinctly trying to get a grasp on everything before, while I was writing the book. And everybody just seemed to have a different definition of platforms. There was different lenses on it. There wasn't really a political economy focus, at least from that sort of critical perspective that I tried to take. And so the book was in many ways an attempt to try and understand digital platforms for myself. And a similar sort of thing happens with Silicon Empires. It was, to begin with, very much an attempt, from my own part to try and understand what was going on in the AI world. Because if you follow the AI world at all, you know that there's so much going on. And every day there's some major new story. And it just becomes a question of, well, how do you separate the noise out from what is actually fundamental to this? And how do we understand the behaviors of all of these different actors and try and understand the potential impacts of artificial intelligence? So for me, that was, trying to lay out a basic foundation for understanding these sorts of things, was what I was trying to do within Silicon Empires.
Oh, you sure did. But tell me one thing. In this work, you reframe platforms as economic actors. How should we understand the rise of platform capitalism? Just a tech phenomenon or a change in the system?
Yeah, so I think it's very much a tech-led phenomenon because platforms as an organizational form have existed for a long period of time. And, one of the classic pre-digital examples is something like a shopping mall. The shopping mall is a platform which allows, shoppers to come in on one hand, but also independent stores and franchises and all that to come in on the other side of this platform. So we've had platforms for a long time, but they never sort of had the prominence that they started to take in the late 2000s and then into the 2010s, and of course, dominating today. So it was that digital aspect, that technological aspect, which really facilitated their capacity to enter into all these different industries in ways that hadn't previously been possible. So I think that is like a core driver. The impacts of them go far beyond the technological, and the ways in which they sort of get ingratiated within a particular industry, of course, is not just technological. And Uber is a really good example of this, the ways in which, it sort of warped existing regulations around the taxi industry and around employment. All of that sort of stuff got warped by the introduction of this technology, and was sort of part and parcel of the platformization of a particular industry. So it's, digital led, technological led, but I think it's far broader than just that.
Mhm. But in the end, these platforms, they shape the labor, the markets, data flows. What does this mean for researchers? So when they're building data-intensive projects today, because most projects are data-intensive, what constraints or what advantages can they get from this platform capitalism?
Yeah, I guess there's a number of different ways to take that sort of question. I think one aspect is the ways in which research about these sorts of things has changed, and particularly in terms of access is what I'm thinking about. So the sort of Web 2.0 era where everything was open and interoperable and, the sort of vision of a highly decentralized and user-driven sort of internet, that's disappeared in the wake of the rise of these centralized platforms. But the centralized platforms have meant a lot of that access has been closed down. So whether it be, API access or other direct access that you might have had to the sort of content and streams of information being produced on these platforms, a lot of that is closed down. And, Meta is a good example, and X is another example. It makes it much harder to study these things as a result of their becoming more closed in. So I think that's one thing to note. I will also mention, I think there's an interesting, and this is very new, I think, an interesting sort of emerging phenomenon about using AI technology to study these sorts of things and the ways in which it might foster a move away from more centralized platforms and like storing your research in a centralized platform. So the example is something like an AI agent today, and the really popular example on Twitter at the moment is Claude Code. And one of the virtues of Claude Code is that you give it access to your local files, and then you can chat with it about your local files. And the value that people are getting from it depends not on what's stored in a centralized platform or anything. It's about what's stored on their hard drives, basically. And this is, I think, an interesting shift that's just emerging, is that we're able to do this sort of stuff much more locally, and in ways which it hasn't been the trend over the past decade, I would say. More and more research has sort of been reliant upon these centralized platforms, and there's perhaps a move away to a more local-based, decentralized version.
Is that do you see that as a reaction to the what is called the enshittification phenomena of these
Yeah,
platforms?
exactly. Yeah. I think this is one of the virtues of AI at the moment, and it may not stay this way, and it probably
Yeah.
won't stay this way, but AI is not enshittified yet. So when you
Yet.
ask it a question, it gives you a pretty direct answer. It doesn't have, teams of people trying to optimize to get into these LLMs yet. But that will come, I think, and it's a sort of brief moment of non-enshittification that we have right now.
Let me just make a parenthesis to say that whenever I talk about this in Portuguese, I always use the English word enshittification, because trust me, the Portuguese word is much, much worse. So I always would use the English word. I have another question for you, kind of a bit of a provocation. In Silicon Empires, you describe the struggle over AI between big corporations and states. My question is that struggle still going on, or have the corporations already won?
It's very dependent on the countries, I would say. The US is in a curious sort of situation. And one of the arguments I try and make in the book is that oftentimes there's an assumption of the sort of immediate alignment of interest between the US state and US tech companies. And I think that did hold for a long time, but I'm not convinced that it holds anymore. What I think is happening in the US at the moment is you've got these clear leading companies, frontier companies, pushing the edges of AI research and what's possible with AI. And the US government is highly dependent on them. And in terms of AI policy, is sort of following in line with what those companies want. Now, that being said, I think there's also a growing wariness in the US state about dependency on these big tech companies, particularly when it comes to issues of national security. So there's a growing sort of awareness that, corporate interests may not align with the interest of the US government. So there's I think a sort of reshifting of power and of control going on at the moment. It's largely corporate driven, I would say, in the US, but that's not necessarily a given in the future. By contrast, a place like China is the opposite. It's much more driven by the state and what the state wants. And my reading of the tech crackdown in 2021, 2022, is that this was a moment where the state basically told specifically platform companies, stop focusing all your attention on these somewhat frivolous things and focus on building up our national self-sufficiency in technology. And there's been some great research which has shown how impactful the trade war beginning in 2018, how impactful those actions by the US government were in terms of what the Chinese government then considered. Tech self-sufficiency just wasn't a top priority for the government until that sort of stuff started happening. And then it became a matter of like, well, we need to channel our leading tech companies in that direction as well. And I think that's what's been happening since the crackdown, is that the ones who were sort of knocked back a peg, Alibaba and Tencent most notably, they're now falling more in line with national self-interest and sort of building up that self-sufficiency.
Now, this obviously has impacts on the innovation ecosystems in both of those countries. What about other countries? The innovation ecosystems of other countries, does this struggle matter to them?
It does, and I think especially in the wake of Trump's sort of boisterous comments and belligerence towards allies. There's obviously a very much a growing concern with digital sovereignty and countries trying to chart their own path forward that isn't dependent on the American tech stack and isn't dependent on the Chinese tech stack, but at least allows countries to have some sovereignty over particular elements of that stack, even if it's not the entire thing. The EU is probably the biggest example, although in practice, it's still somewhat, I think, confused and trying to do a little bit of everything. But you've also got South Korea, you've got India, you've got Brazil, you've got a variety of different countries which are charting out different attempts at AI sovereignty and digital sovereignty more broadly. So for them, there's clear sort of political goals that they want to enable. And the government efforts are, trying to foster the development of those goals and channel innovation in those directions.
In your opinion, how could they do that? How could Europe or the UK or South Korea, the countries you mentioned, what instruments do they have to support domestic innovation in this area? Because it's if you look at the news, it's a lot of money. You gotta have deep pockets to make all those investments. So is there anything the smaller states can do?
I think it is possible. I think South Korea is in a unique position because they have these quite crucial technology companies and they have a long history of industrial policy supporting political goals. So South Korea is somewhat unique, and I don't think they can necessarily be a model for many other countries. I think Europe is one of the more interesting cases precisely because it potentially has the resources to do quite a bit. It's got, the economic resources. It doesn't necessarily have the political institutions to bring these things out and implement them in the ways that they would desire. But it does have that potential. So I think it's an interesting one to follow. My big sort of question around digital sovereignty is, and especially AI sovereignty, is what is it for? And what are you capable of doing? So as you say, AI is extremely expensive to do. And I think last year, 2024, the company spent, 2025, the company spent, $1/3 trillion on capital expenditures. So the big four AI companies in the US, huge amounts of money. And that's a load of money to be spending even for governments, 100 billion, let's say, per year. If your intention is to try and follow the American model and to chase after that leading edge in innovation, I think it's extremely expensive. And in most cases, it's a waste of money. What happens is you build up these massive data centers, you go and train a model for a few months, you spend loads and loads of money doing it. And then about 3 months later, and a competitor comes out and beats you. So you might have the top tier model for a few months and then you're back to the square one. So it's a lot of money for not much gain, I think. So that becomes the question of, well, what is digital sovereignty all about and what is AI sovereignty all about if it's not taking that sort of leading edge in innovation? And I think here, the sort of distinction between innovation and diffusion is a really useful one. There's a lot to be gained by diffusion, but I think there's also a lot to be gained by thinking about innovation, not just in pushing those sort of scaling laws forward and building bigger models and bigger data centers, but also thinking about things like alternative architectures and thinking about the ways in which these AI models today are not just sort of independent things which do everything on themselves. In fact, what's happening is that they're welded onto a whole series of different computational tools. And there's a lot of innovation that could be built into those tools and into the standards which allow these things to be talking with each other. So I think here there's a real space for innovation to occur in a way which doesn't cost a lot of money, but which is highly impactful because you could be setting the standards that maintain, for
Hmm.
instance, interoperability for years to come. So that sort of thing, I think, has a lot more value than trying to chase after the American model, which, it gets all the attention, but it's also ultimately a big waste of money in many ways.
Well, to your point, I was quite surprised to see that the company that had the highest valuation or the highest growth in valuation in last year was a Japanese company, not then NVIDIA, but a Japanese company that makes memory chips, not the processors that NVIDIA does, but memory chips. But because those are also necessary. There's a lot going on with these data centers. But one question I was thinking about when you are talking, don't we tend to confuse LLMs with AI? Is there more to AI than LLMs? And are there other areas where there's a lot still to be done?
Yeah, I think we do. When we talk about AI today, it's almost always LLMs and generative AI. And I think partly there's a good reason for that, which is simply that not only is it the most impactful sort of expression of AI today, but oftentimes things that we did before the transformer architecture that's behind LLMs, things that we used to use like CNNs and RNNs and all these different approaches to the architecture of AI, a lot of that's now being replaced with transformers simply because the transformer architecture is more effective. So yes, LLMs, AI is broader than LLMs, but I think LLMs are so central to what we're
Hmm.
doing with AI today that it's 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 not a shorthand which loses much, I would say, in terms of coherence and sort of accuracy. That being said, I think there's plenty of room, and loads of companies are researching this. There is plenty of room to think about different architectures, to think about the limits of transformers, to think about the ways in which, are we sort of reaching some of the a saturation point with some of these models, which I think is an open question. I don't think that's closed by
Hmm.
any means, but there is a very clear growing consensus that LLMs are not sufficient to, develop artificial general intelligence or something like that, and that we will need to build new architectures and new approaches to AI. So there's lots of innovation that can be done in that space.
Mhm. A lot to be seen. Okay. For people working in that area, for a researcher or a startup that is submitting an Horizon Europe proposal, for example, the UK just joined the Horizon Europe, am I right? Yeah. So if this proposal involves data or AI, and most proposals do, what is your advice? What strategic considerations from platform economics should they use in their proposal?
So for researchers applying,
Yes.
I don't
I know
know. That's a good
it's a
question.
lot. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I would, I mean, I guess it would
But
follow in line sort of with what I've said already, which is the focus on diffusion and application, as opposed to just trying to
okay.
push in the same direction that these large tech companies are working with. And then also the sort of system of tools and frameworks and harnesses that are being built up around these models. I think there's a lot of room for applying for funding to help to build up that area as well.
It's funny you say that because just this morning I was reading a comment in my Substack newsletter that she was saying she has been in several occasions of grant concession committees where she realized they were more worried about how would that each proposal connects with what already exists with the platforms. Then they were more worried about that than with the innovation merit on itself. So uh, nowadays all projects need to make this balance between impact and innovation. Impact has become a keyword in EU proposals. And you don't have impact without platforms nowadays. The way I see it, you can't do it. So, is there any insights you can provide for researchers for those writing proposals that will help them design these more resilient, more scalable research projects?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think you're absolutely right that if you're thinking about impact, platforms are sort of inevitable. Getting it out via social media, getting it out via podcasting platforms, whatever the case might be, it's somewhat inevitable. I think though, and this sort of goes back to my earlier point about the shift towards local file-based AI agents and things like that. There's sort of two aspects of that I think are quite interesting. One is making your sort of research material available in formats which allow people to then take it up and, sort of download it locally and work with it. The other thing is that actually these tools are really good, increasingly really good at being able to, let's say, put together your own personal website that maintains and hosts all of these things as well. So you can sort of move away from, some of the reliance on these big platforms by simply going back to like that Web 2.0 ideal of building your own personal website and things like that. So I think, there's growing options available. And yeah, making your research, I think, I mean, I know there's debates around this, what people think, but making your research sort of available to be picked up and deployed in and through AI, I think is quite valuable. I think it is shaping collective conversations and collective knowledge in a new way and in a quite impactful and powerful way as well.
I can't help asking you this question. Are you optimistic about the future of AI and well, about the future?
Yeah. I think so. Let me say, I'm not a pessimist in terms of what AI can do. I don't think it's just a bunch of hype that will disappear and that it'll go away. I think it is. I think it is being massively adopted by people already. It will be adopted by companies, and it will transform basically every industry. It will transform education, it will transform research, it will transform how we do all of these different things very, very much. Whether that ends up better for most people, I think is very much an open question. I'm probably quite pessimistic about that. But I think that there is still utility and value, and there is, part of the reason why I wrote Silicon Empires was to say that this stuff is going to be impactful. And at the moment, the key decisions about it are being made by a handful of extremely wealthy people and powerful people, and that we need to be thinking about how we shape this technology in better directions for more people. So yeah, I'm pessimistic that will happen.
Can that be done? Can you do that?
I think it can. I think it can. This is, again, it goes back to why I think the focus on digital sovereignty should not just be about building leading models, but building particular standards, precisely because I think we're at a moment where a lot of these standards are still in formation. They're not settled, and there's not a consensus about them, and that there's space to implement standards which carry certain public values that we want to maintain. Things like interoperability and openness and preventing sort of proprietary closed-in systems. I'll give a very simple example, which is in the era of AI agents, your personal data is extremely important. Yesterday, Google announced personal intelligence, which is going to be reliant upon your personal data to give you really personal insights. So your personal data is extremely valuable to making this stuff useful. but it's not set in stone yet about whether that personal data is going to be like it was in the social media area, collected by platforms, controlled by platforms, and centralized by them, or will personal data remain with you and you can bring it to different AI agents in the future. So setting those sort of public values about we want this stuff to be portable, we want interoperability, we want to prevent the formation of big tech monopolies and AI. All of that stuff, I think there's room to be channeling technology in those directions right now.
That will be the next decade, or less.
Not even next decade, next 3 years. Yeah. It's a very short time span we have, and I think we need to be focusing on it.
I agree with you. One final question. Is there any practical insight you can give researchers, innovators to how to deal with these changes, these challenges?
Yeah, it's I think it's going to be difficult for a lot of people, especially if, there's a somewhat romantic ideal, I think, of intellectual life, which persists in many, many disciplines of like the sort of individual thinking through all of these things and then going out and publishing and making their contribution to this body of knowledge. And I think there's still absolutely a place for that sort of thing. But increasingly, what these tools enable us to do is to do it in a much more collective way, to do it in a much more rapid way, and to sort of facilitate asking and answering questions that may not have been possible previously. I would encourage people to play with these tools. If you tried ChatGPT once in 2023 and thought this is nonsense, you were probably right then. But things have really changed and things are changing dramatically fast. And I think having an eye to what these tools can do is really useful, and thinking about how to build these systems, research systems, institutional, intellectual systems in ways that, for instance, don't just simply play into the hands of the major academic publishers, that don't just play into the hands of the big AI companies. Thinking about how we as researchers would want to design these systems is really crucial for us to be doing.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time, for this chat. I'm sure it will be very valuable for my audience. And I hope to keep reading your work and let's keep an optimistic view of all. And most of all, let's keep working on it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.